Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is a program bringing you news, views, discussion on religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, a magazine of well over 100 years history dealing with church-state issues and the separation of church and state. And my guest is Ed Cook, Dr. Ed Cook. Welcome back. You've been on programs before, and you've written quite a few articles for Liberty Magazine. Yep. So you're a true insider.
Oh, thank you.
Since your doctorate is on church-state studies, let's hit the ground running by talking about secularism.
All right.
It's been trendy of late, in religious liberty circles at least, to see the challenge to religious liberty as from a secular quarter. Mm-hmm. And I remember a few years ago now, but it seems like yesterday to me, Pope Benedict, when he was newly minted, gave a speech at Regensburg University where he laid an awful lot of the ills troubling Christianity at the feet of secularism.
Yes.
You remember that, the Regensburg speech?
Yes.
So where does secularism figure into all this?
Well, the first thing, just to kind of orient it from that speech, right? From 1962, when Vatican II took place, until the current time, the perspective of the Catholic Church globally is that secularism is something that, due to several German philosophers like Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and at one time Peter Berger. Now Peter Berger has switched. He used to argue that eventually societies would evolve around the world until they all became purely secular, meaning having no religious orientation. But he's changed his viewpoint.
I don't want to rain on your parade,
Yep.
but this is my view. Do you think philosophers determine the way the world thinks, or the other way around? They reflect what the world thinks.
Well, they have had quite a lot of influence.
Yes, they've had a huge influence.
I mean, like, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche, his writings railing against God and the God is dead idea that ended up playing over into the following century in the 1900s, and that were picked up and adopted by portions of Nazism.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what popularized Nietzsche more than just the intellectuals that might have read him. But I think and I'm not saying that, but I think the biggest sweep of history, the explanation for our modern secularism, is more easily found in the disillusionment that followed the Great War and the great killing off and the seeming failure of religion and the possibility, which we've never gotten over under the nuclear threat, the possibility that it's all going to blow up in our faces any moment. So it's certainly between the wars, it was Wine, Women and Song, the Flappers, and the Berlin nightlife. I think that's where this prevailing secularism hit Western society, and it was popularized by a number of philosophers who codified what was sort of floating around in the what's the word they use, there's a term now online for the global mindset, the
globalization, global community.
No, I'll think about it later. But anyhow, there's most people don't read philosophers. You know that. Well, they have an influence that percolates through. But just like laws and people obeying them, which comes first? The desire to pass the laws, or do the laws create the behavior?
Mm-hmm. Well, there certainly is, one can say, some ration to that argument. At the same time, though, I would kind of look at some historical documents. The Catholic Church back in the late 1800s identified within Christianity a movement that among Protestant theologians that was more from a Bible-centered basis of faith, moving to the idea of higher criticism of the Bible.
Yes,
and that was part of what came out of a Christian perspective, Christian philosophy, you might say. But at the same time, I believe that there were secular philosophers that bought into that and contributed to it, in essence, that developed more of the idea of a secular idea
on higher criticism. I think it came from increased knowledge and learning. I don't think it came from cynicism. It just came from knowledge, and most particularly, because I'm barely old enough to remember it, the Dead Sea Scrolls or opened Pandora's box, and it's never quite been closed. But people just decided, stop talking about it. There are things that came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are problematic to this day about the extent of the canon and what else existed and so on.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But you know, the thing that I would kind of use as well to affirm faith is that from the Dead Sea Scrolls there were certain things that actually helped to solidify and augment the inerrancy of Scripture, as far as the passages, like in the portion of the book of Daniel that they found. They actually compared it to the Codex Alexandrinus that was found back in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, written back at that time period, and they recognized there had been no change. So one can kind of look at the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery and say, yeah, it could go in the side of pessimism or lack of faith.
Well, I don't know that pessimism is the right word, but just the Dead Sea Scrolls opened a whole vista of what documents were around and what theology was present that no one had much thought about till that point. And I've read even recently some books on it. I don't think they've even been addressed because it scares people to, not people of true faith, biblical faith, because you base it on that, but it scares these investigators where it will lead them. It's almost unthinkable. And not least the Gnostic Gospels, but the distinction between Gnostic Gospels and some of the more traditional writings is not as clear as we might think.
Well, you know, based on that, I would say that you know, whether there's people that are, as one would say, with no religious orientation, that believe fully in evolution, but even that doesn't give all of the answers. So just as one's religious perspective may not give all of the answers, that's no reason to reject one's faith outright.
And this is what we would say on this whole network. The role of faith is central. I mean, you can't prove everything. You have to have a faith that's based on a certain logic, but faith by definition, you jump off. And just living in a secular world, you have to have certain faith. I mean, the little kid in school, how does he know Newton's law of gravity other than that things fall and drop on his foot or whatever? But you're taking in faith someone that you trust that's a knowledgeable person. You take in faith that the sun will rise the next day. An amazing amount of what we think is cut and dried reality really exists on faith.
Correct. You know, coming back though to that aspect of the late 1800s, the Catholic Church in papal pronouncements actually was condemning certain of the philosophical movements that were beginning in Germany at the time that led into the 20th century, more of the fuller development, where eventually Peter, one of the philosophers that I mentioned, who became a sociology of religion expert, if one may say the term, or scholar, was Peter Berger. Now, just for the sake of giving him full defense, in essence, originally he was arguing in the book The Sacred Canopy that societies would evolve to the point and become so modernized that there would be no idea or concept of God or religion whatsoever, purely secular. However, with
the God is dead era, right?
It was the further development of that, because in essence Nietzsche had the idea God is dead. He wrote a lot about that in some of his later writings, and then the further development of that into the 20th century with Peter Berger basically adopting the Sacred Canopy, where he gives a very rationalistic, logical argumentation for how religions evolved, how man, in essence, his argument is that man created his religion that we see displayed in different cultures around the world. But the point is that by the 1990s, with the resurgence of fundamentalist religions, that completely refuted his theory, and so now he's switched and he's admitted that, well, sociology of religion doesn't explain everything, and actually he is somebody who does have adopts a position of faith at the current time, and argues that one should question one's faith but not fully reject it. So he's done some bit of a turnaround.
We've been through the grill as a society in general. Disillusionment between the wars, then scientific exploration, like for years in the United States. I heard people say, well, we can get a man on the moon, surely we can do this. It's like everything's possible to human beings. We're now understanding that everything's not possible, that the universe is opening up before us. We're just little creatures, even as our technical advance continues. But relative to everything, it's not overwhelming.
Correct.
So I think there's a sort of a an existential angst that's come over the modern world, and that's not good for religion. But the Roman Catholic Church is pursuing a two-pronged view, I think. They're hoping to just rally people because of their historic role, and don't ask questions and come with us. And at the same time, they're also encouraging Bible study and examination of the Word. But the Catholic Church has never been that keen or insistent upon verbal inspiration or the accuracy of the Scripture. Don't need it, because the authority derives from the Church, not from the Scripture.
Yeah. But the Church, the role of the Catholic Church addressing the idea of secularism, from Vatican II to the present time, the Church has adopted the perspective, whether one would argue that whether it's true or not, about the idea of secularism being prevalent in countries around the world as countries become more modernized. But the Church has adopted the viewpoint that secularism is in essence the dominant giant that needs to be conquered in society, and for that reason has sought to close ranks with non-Catholics, with other religious groups, even non-Christian groups, pulling together to say religion has its place in society as opposed to a completely non-religious society.
And, we were talking about the Regensburg speech, where 2 of his 3 threats to a non-violent Christianity were secularism. I must admit, I don't even understand the second and third points, why they would be a threat. I've always focused on the first threat that he said that I thought was just Reformation baiting, because he says that Christianity became non-violent because of adopting Greek rationality. To me, that's sort of paganism, but anyhow. And then he says the reformers, by their insistence on sola scriptura, exposed Christianity to violence again. In other words, a jihadi, like, this is the holy book, I'll fight to the death before I change it. But I don't understand the secularism. Secularism is a counter threat to all religion, because it just sucks the air out of the room for religion. But I don't think it's an antagonist per se.
No, in fact, one of the things that I always like to share with individuals that may tend to adopt more of a secular mindset, or one could even say an atheistic perspective, is that even modern atheism in its truest sense and understanding is dependent upon religion. And I usually get a baffled look from secularists and atheists when I say that, and I go on to explain the English term atheist derives from the Greek atheteo, which is not saying that God is not denying God, it's just saying the negative of God. The a that precedes the theteo is, in Greek language, it means the negative of. So theteo is the idea, the concept of God. That's where we get theos.
Doubter.
Yeah. So the atheist, the atheteo, is really somebody that in order to adopt their position, they must first acknowledge the existence of God in order to be able to negate that. You can't deny a negative, right? Or you can't deny something that doesn't exist. So secularists in that regard, and atheists in particular, are they can thank religionists for taking the first position.
And Dawkins, I've listened to a lot of his stuff. He's the atheist, English atheist that travels around. And it's very curious, because he's very attracted to the forms of religion. Nice hymns and even the morality of religion. But he has issues with assertions of God and the details of heavenly existence and so on. And on a certain level that's understandable. It's regrettable, because if nothing else, it doesn't give people peace of mind. There's this, they're between heaven and hell, literally.
Yep.
And that's the sickness of our age, I think. But this is the question well, we need to have a break. I see we're just too far over our halfway point, so stay with us. We'll be back in a few moments. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, I was making an unforgettable point that I've forgotten now. But we need to pick up. We were talking about secularism and some of the conundrums that are built into the modern mind. We basically need to believe, and yet the modern world has given us so many counterfacts and disturbing counter-arguments that it's hard to have a simple faith.
Yep.
And that, I think that's the greatest risk as we come to what I think many Christians, certainly Adventists, would say the end of time. We're in the last days. Jesus said that. That was 2,000 years ago. We're also told in our Adventist writings, picking up from Daniel and elsewhere, that the last movements will be rapid ones. And we're in such a time of rapid, not just developments, but social change.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I've pointed out to people that if you think about it, the Industrial Revolution shook the world up, caused wars and dislocations and famines and all the rest. And that took place over about 100 years at least. But in a couple of decades, our world has been turned on its head by computerization and the whole electronic.
The internet. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's a massive revolution. But it happened in a much shorter time. So we're absorbing change almost weekly now that other generations might not see it in a lifetime.
Correct.
And I think that's hard to keep faith. It's hard to keep religion in its appropriate sphere when this is going on.
Yeah, I was going to say that you know, so much information in such a short time, psychologically anyway, can have that impact of disorienting one generation to the next. You know,
yeah.
And that of course would have some kind of an impact on one's faith and orientation. And in the larger picture, larger scheme of things, looking at church-state relations and secularism and, you know, what role it may or may not have, I think that it's important to note that at least in the American context, there are certain religious groups that will argue that point as a straw man to argue the need to establish religion by government decree,
well, I think
in essence.
That's where we're heading. Things are so out of control. You know, at the moment, every day somebody's lost their job because of some action or statement at work that's just unacceptable. You know, it's not that it was ever acceptable, but we're sort of in a moralistic purge at the moment. And that's unsettling people. Then you've got natural calamities, you've got looming war and so on. It's certain, and we've heard it already from a few of the leaders, like after 9/11. You know, this has come upon us because of homosexuality, right? You can bet your life that at some point the US is going to seek a grand religious solution to all of this.
Yep.
Quite apart from martial law and other possibilities that they all may happen. But there has to be a religious rallying point.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so important, you know, the contributions like through your program, helping us to be informed about not only the American context, but what's happening in church-state relations in other countries, because those are things we can learn from.
Yeah.
You know, for example, in France, ever since the French Revolution.
Very different model.
Yes, they adopted more of a laïcité model.
Well, you know history very well. Most people have forgotten it. But the French Revolution, there were many causes to it, not least of which great disparity between the rich and the poor. Remember Marie Antoinette, when she heard the crowds were rioting for bread, well, let them eat cake. Mm-hmm. For her, there was plenty of cake around. She didn't realize they had nothing. But all of that was at play. But what really went on in France when you talk about religion, there was a violent rejection of religion and the role of the Roman Catholic Church, which was part and parcel of their repression.
Anti-clericalism.
Yes, so it really was get rid of the lot of them. And of course those days are long gone, but I think residually there's a suspicion in France of intrusion by any religion, where the US has never had that.
Correct. Yeah, and in America, you know, we can be thankful for the contributions of John Locke from England, which he adopted more of what we would call the English Enlightenment, that saw a positive role for religion in society, not necessarily endorsed by government, but nonetheless a positive role. And in essence, one could kind of summarize it by saying that in the American context, our key founding fathers recognized that religion not only did it hold government accountable as the highest authority, but the citizen was held accountable to some kind of a concept of a just rewards or penalty at the end of one's life. So with those elements in society, it gave an undergirding for morality.
Yeah. I think there would, now I'm getting into my philosophy, there's two elements among many others probably that partly explain what happened in the US. You can't separate the thinkers like, well, Franklin and his peers. you can't separate them from Englishmen. They were Englishmen. They just happened to be on this side of the big pond. And what was happening in England, they hadn't rejected religion, but because of science and enlightenment and so on, they had a form of religion they called deism. It's basically don't deny God, but you're an atheist on a lot of the particulars. So it was, the Bible says, having the form of religion but denying the power thereof, right? That was, so I think most of them had that view. They weren't anti-religious, but they had a sort of a deistic cynicism. Mm-hmm. Then some of them, like Patrick Henry, you know, he would stamp you down and stick the spear in if you were a different religion. He was a religious zealot, right? Mm. But they were afraid of those types, and there were not enough of them in any one faction to really force this country into a religious identity. And something we barely talk about on this program, established churches were very common in the colonies, but they were not the same churches from one place to the other. So it was balkanized, and all of them had an interest in making sure the federal government was neutral. Yep. So many things conspired. Some sociological, some educational, some just religious structural,
denominational differences.
So it isn't true to say that all of them wanted religion out of the public sphere, but for a variety of reasons, all of them saw that as the safe course. Mm-hmm. And I think they were vindicated in it. Yep. And to this day, American culture, while it's as hedonistic as any in the West, you know, a lot of bread, even cake, leads to obesity and lax morals and all the rest. You know, we're hardly the godliest nation, but the religious affinities of the United States are very strong, much stronger than Europe.
Oh, yes. Yep.
And religious dynamic has to be taken into account of, and that's a good thing. It can be steered in very positive directions more easily than the old world, and clearly way more easily than countries on the fringe of the Christian world, or even other religious cultures that don't have the same enlightened history that the West has gone through.
Correct. And, you know, that's why I think that church-state scholars correctly analyzing American history and documents, you know, decisions by the Supreme Court, etc., when they look at America, the American context, and they term it benevolent neutrality, in essence meaning that government is there as a neutral arbiter among religious groups.
But it has a favorable view of religion. It's
yes,
not at
correct.
all
not anti-religious.
Anti-religious, no. And I hope that day never comes.
Yes.
And we're certainly, there's no evidence that the present government, even though we have a very secular president, there's hardly an antagonism to religion.
Correct.
And in fact, President Trump, I think a little bit outrageously, has been called the modern Cyrus. So they're reading into his secularism great religious import.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I believe that at any point in American history, there certainly are groups, religious groups, that will seek affinity, you know, with whoever it may be that's in power, seeking favors or whatever. But that's also why, as you pointed out, I think that the Founding Fathers wisely instituted through the Constitution and through the First Amendment that idea of separation of church and state.
It's a wonderful protective mechanism, and this program and Liberty Magazine always arguing for separation of church and state.
Yep.
Right.
So those ideas of separation of church and state found in the American Constitution as well as in other founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, it argues for the idea of respect for religion, but at the same time no undue preference for religion. And for that reason, a very distinct separation between church and state in which each fulfills their given role to provide a well-ordered society where peace can prevail among its citizens and where various religious views can be expounded upon and accepted by citizens as they weigh them out and make decisions on their own.
Stalin's gulags aside, it seems to me that secularism is less an antagonist for religion than an unwilling listener, a sort of a I don't want to hear about it cynic. Secularism is indeed a byproduct of the modern era where the busyness of life has crowded out the divine. And I think rather than seeing secularism as another religion, as has been said, or an overt enemy. Religionists, and Christians in particular, should see secularism as the great challenge to engage the secular mindset with something that has a higher, transcendent, appealing value. But to see secularism as the enemy directly is for the boring, like the boring preacher, to accuse the unlistening crowd of being irreligious. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.